It is the night of the 16th of January, 1941, somewhere above the Somerset countryside, 4 miles from the city of Bristol. A German bomber crew, guided by radio beams they trust completely, sees exactly what they expect to see below. A city already burning, orange light flickering off low cloud, the unmistakable glow of a raid in progress. They release their bombs. Explosions ripple across the ground in bright, violent flashes. Job done, they turn for home, confident their payload has added to the destruction of a British industrial city. Except there is no city beneath them. There are no factories, no docks, no terraced streets, no people. There is a field on Blackdown in the Mendip Hills, a handful of oil drums, some carefully wired braziers, and 2 men crouched in a concrete bunker, watching the sky and pulling levers by hand. For the rest of the war, nobody in Germany would know it. Most people in Britain never knew it either, not at the time, and many still do not know it today. This was Operation Starfish, one of the most successful deception campaigns of the Second World War, and it very nearly disappeared from history altogether, buried under Official Secrets Act restrictions that were not fully lifted for decades. Historical records suggest that by the end of the war, close to 1,000 tons of German bombs fell not on Britain's cities, but on empty fields built to look like them. Some of those fields, when archaeologists finally went looking decades later, showed barely any trace of what had happened there at all, which only deepens the mystery of how effective and how well hidden this operation truly was. How was an entire branch of Hitler's Air Force fooled night after night by men with buckets of paraffin, some scaffolding poles, and a handful of film industry tricks borrowed from the studios of pre-war British cinema? Why does a program that ultimately protected 81 British towns and cities remain, even now, a story that most people have simply never heard? To understand that, we have to go back to the desperate, uncertain summer of 1939, before a single bomb had fallen on Britain at all, when one retired Air Ministry officer was asked to imagine in advance exactly how the enemy might be tricked. By the late 1930s, Britain's Air Ministry was acutely aware that the next war, if it came, would not be fought only in the trenches or at sea. It would be fought from the air, over British homes, factories, and airfields, and there was no reliable way to stop a determined bomber force from finding its target once it was overhead. Fighter defenses and anti-aircraft guns could shoot down some raiders, but they could do nothing to disguise what a pilot could see with his own eyes. In September 1939, just as war was declared, the Air Ministry turned to Colonel John Fisher Turner, an engineer who had overseen the rapid expansion of RAF airfields between 1937 and 1939. Though technically retired, Turner was recalled to establish what would eventually become a national program of deception, tasked with building decoys convincing enough to draw enemy bombs away from the real targets beneath them. His earliest work focused on RAF airfields themselves, which were obvious and vulnerable targets, easily identified from the air by their long, pale runways and clusters of hangars. Turner's team built dummy aircraft, dummy hangars, and dummy runways at sites given the code name K, hoping to draw daylight bombing raids away from operational stations. By October 1939, barely a month into the war, Turner had already developed plans for both day and night decoys, an unusually rapid response for a department that had in effect been invented on the spot. As German tactics shifted towards night bombing during 1940, Turner adapted, creating Q sites, fields of carefully arranged lights on poles, designed to mimic the glow of an airfield's flare path when viewed from several thousand feet in the dark. It was a simple idea, but it worked often enough that Turner's small department was given growing resources and a wider remit, and when German bombers began carrying larger numbers of incendiary bombs, Turner added small controlled fires to some Q sites as well, creating what his teams called Q-Fire, an early forerunner of the far larger Starfish network that followed. Then, on the night of 14th to 15th November 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched a devastating raid on Coventry, using new radio navigation technology to guide hundreds of bombers to the city with unprecedented accuracy. The city's historic cathedral was gutted, its industrial heart was shattered, and several hundred people were killed, in a raid so severe that the Germans reportedly coined a new verb to describe a city being Coventrated. Most historians agree that Coventry marked a turning point, both in the ferocity of the Blitz and in Britain's determination to find new ways of defending its cities, not just with guns, but with deception. In the aftermath of Coventry, Turner was ordered to expand his decoy program far beyond airfields. He was tasked with protecting 7 major urban and industrial centers, including Derby, Bristol, Manchester, Sheffield, Middlesbrough, Crewe, and areas around London, using a new kind of decoy designed specifically to imitate a city already ablaze. Turner called these new sites Special Fire, abbreviated to SF. One of the earliest built to protect Bristol was constructed near the village of Rington and given the working nickname Starfish. The name stuck, and before long, every decoy of this type across the country was known simply as a Starfish site. The principle behind a Starfish site was straightforward, but its execution required real ingenuity. German bombing raids typically arrived in waves. The first wave, guided by radio beams and experienced Pathfinder crews, would drop incendiary bombs to set the target alight, creating a visible beacon for the bombers that followed. Turner's insight was that if a decoy site could be made to burst into flame at exactly the right moment, timed to coincide with the real raid beginning nearby, later waves of bombers might mistake the decoy fire for the fire they had been told to expect and drop their bombs on empty countryside instead. Sites were built roughly 4 miles from the city they were protecting and at least a mile from any other settlement, close enough to be mistaken for the target from altitude, far enough away that stray bombs would fall on farmland rather than homes. Turner assembled an unusual team to design these illusions. Many of the men who built and operated the sites came from the British film industry, where wartime blackout restrictions had forced studios to master the art of simulating fire, explosions, and light, using controlled, repeatable techniques on indoor sets. Carpenters, electricians, and special effects technicians who had spent years building convincing illusions for the cinema now applied the same skills to fields in Somerset, Derbyshire, and Yorkshire, only this time the audience was several thousand feet up, traveling at well over 200 miles an hour, and utterly convinced they were looking at a real target. If you're enjoying this story, subscribing helps the channel bring more thoroughly researched history every week. The technical side of a Starfish site was more sophisticated than a simple bonfire. Engineers developed several categories of controlled fire, each designed to replicate a different stage of an incendiary raid. Basket fires, or coal fires, used wood and coal in metal cages to create a steady glow, imitating a building that had caught alight and was burning slowly. Boiling oil fires, sometimes called flash fires, used water dripped or sprayed onto boiling oil or creosote to produce sudden violent flashes of light and dark smoke, closely resembling the effect of an incendiary bomb striking an igniting fuel or timber. Some sites added a third type, glow fires, using coal soaked in a small amount of oil to produce a longer, low-level burn that could be sustained for extended periods without needing constant attention. All of these fires were controlled remotely, using electrical ignition switches operated from a small concrete bunker positioned a safe distance away, allowing 2 or 3 men to bring an entire simulated town to life within moments, and crucially, to time the ignition to coincide with reports of German bombers approaching. To put the scale of these installations into everyday terms, imagine several dozen carefully placed campfires and oil drums spread across an area roughly the size of a few football pitches, each one wired individually to a control panel no larger than a household fuse box, operated by men crouched in a bunker built to withstand a direct hit. The nearest safe distance for the operators themselves was judged to be around 500 meters, close enough to control the display precisely, far enough in theory to survive a bomb landing on the fires they had just lit. Alongside the SF sites, Turner's teams also developed QL sites, using carefully shielded and angled electric lighting to simulate the dim illumination of factories, railway yards, or streets during a blackout, and smaller QF sites for more localized decoys protecting individual factories or installations rather than entire towns. Some coastal decoys, including a notably successful site on Sina Common at Hayling Island, were later adapted specifically to protect naval targets such as Portsmouth Harbor, showing how flexible the basic principle proved to be. By January 1941, there were already around 43 of these civil decoy sites protecting Britain's most vulnerable towns and cities, and new sites were being added at a rate of roughly one per day for much of that year, a pace that reflects both the program's growing priority within the Air Ministry and the mounting pressure of the Blitz at sea. By March 1941, the total number of operational sites had passed 100, and by the time the program reached its full extent later in the war, 237 decoy sites were protecting 81 separate towns, cities, and industrial targets across the United Kingdom. Success depended on variables that Turner's teams could never fully control: cloud cover, wind direction, the timing of the real raid, and the experience of the bombers overhead. Some nights, everything went as planned. Decoys near Cardiff and Bristol are recorded as having drawn a significant portion of a raid away from its intended target in February 1941, with one estimate putting the diverted bombing at up to 175 high-explosive bombs in a single set of raids. Other nights, the decoys were ignored entirely or lit too early or too late to convince experienced crews. The system was never a perfect shield, and several of the cities it was built to protect, Bristol among them, still suffered devastating raids despite the presence of nearby decoys. Historians studying the program are careful to note that Starfish sites reduced damage rather than eliminated it, working best in combination with other defenses, including anti-aircraft guns, fighter interception, and, from later in the Blitz, radio countermeasures designed to bend or jam the German navigation beams altogether. Contemporary reports from Royal Observer Corps posts and local air raid precautions wardens, along with later research by historians including Colin Dobinson, whose detailed studies of Britain's decoy program remain a key source on the subject, describe bombers circling repeatedly over decoy sites, apparently searching for confirmation that they had found their target before releasing their bombs onto open ground. Local accounts collected from villages near several Starfish sites recall the strange spectacle of watching German raids pass overhead and then release their bombs onto seemingly empty hillsides, followed by the distant crump of explosions where no target existed, and experienced residents at the time were forbidden from discussing openly because the entire program remained officially secret. Archaeological work carried out decades later at the original Starfish site on Blackdown in the Mendip Hills found no bomb craters at all near the site itself, a puzzle that researchers now attribute to the difficulty of pinpointing exactly where individual wartime raids fell, rather than evidence that the decoy failed. Other Starfish and Q sites across the country do show clear evidence of bombing, with an overall estimate of close to 1,000 tons of ordnance recovered or recorded as having landed on decoy sites rather than genuine targets. Official post-war assessments compiled from Air Ministry records and later summarized by historians such as Basil Collier concluded that the decoy program had measurably reduced the weight of bombs falling on protected towns and cities, even if attributing any single night's escape to the decoys alone remained, in most cases, impossible to prove with certainty. It is worth comparing this British approach with the technology it was designed to defeat. German bomber crews in 1940 and 1941 increasingly relied on radio navigation systems such as Knickebein and, later, the more precise Exjuret, which used intersecting radio beams transmitted from the European mainland to guide aircraft directly over a target and even indicate the correct moment to release bombs, regardless of visibility. On paper, this was a formidable technological advantage, allowing German bombers to strike accurately through cloud and darkness. Britain's decoy program was, by contrast, almost defiantly low-tech: coal, oil, timber, and carefully positioned electric bulbs. Yet the two systems interacted in a way that favored the defender. Radio beams could guide a bomber to the correct general area, but once the crew were overhead, in the dark, under stress, and often being tracked by fighters or anti-aircraft fire, they still had to identify the target visually before releasing their bombs. A convincing fire, correctly timed, exploited exactly that final human moment of judgment. Most historians agree that the most effective British defense during this period was not any single weapon or system, but the combination of several imperfect tools, radar-directed fighters, radio countermeasures, anti-aircraft batteries, and Turner's decoys, each covering the weaknesses of the others. The immediate impact of the Starfish program is difficult to state with complete precision, and historians are careful to avoid overstating individual figures since bomb damage from any given raid could rarely be attributed with total certainty to a single cause. What can be said with confidence is that by the end of the war, Turner's department had built 237 decoy sites protecting 81 towns, cities, and industrial targets across the United Kingdom, and that credible estimates place the weight of bombs diverted onto decoys at somewhere close to 1,000 tons, ordnance that would otherwise have fallen on homes, factories, and civilian populations. Several sources indicate that individual cities, including Derby, Bristol, and Cardiff, experienced specific raids where a meaningful share of the attacking force was drawn away from the real target, even though the towns themselves still suffered serious damage on other nights when weather, timing, or an experienced bomber crew defeated the illusion. The program's long-term legacy extends well beyond the Second World War. The principles Turner's team developed, that an enemy's technology is only as good as the human judgment interpreting it, and that a cheap, well-timed illusion can outperform an expensive countermeasure, went on to influence later deception and camouflage operations, including aspects of the elaborate Allied deception campaigns that preceded the D-Day landings in 1944. Because the entire program operated under strict wartime secrecy and many of its records remained closed for years afterwards, Starfish sites were largely forgotten by the public, surviving today mainly as earthworks, concrete bunkers, and scorched patches of ground on hillsides in Somerset, Derbyshire, Yorkshire, and elsewhere, some now marked with local heritage information boards, others identified only through aerial archaeology and wartime records held in the National Archives. So return for a moment to that January night above the Mendip Hills. In the cockpit of a German bomber, a crew watches fire bloom on the ground below them and believes, entirely reasonably, that they are looking at Bristol. They cannot see the two men in the bunker, timing each flash of burning oil to the rhythm of a raid they can hear but not see, translating a British innovation of blacked-out film studios and borrowed stagecraft into a weapon that saved lives without firing a single shot. There is no conclusive evidence that any individual raid was entirely deflected by a single decoy, and historians rightly resist the temptation to claim any one Starfish site single-handedly saved a city. What the evidence does show consistently across hundreds of documented incidents and close to 1,000 tons of misdirected bombs is a quieter, more human kind of victory. A small, secretive department operating almost entirely out of public view that understood something about its enemy that no amount of radio technology could overcome, that in the final moment before a bomb falls, someone still has to look down and decide what they are seeing. Today, little remains of most Starfish sites beyond faint earthworks, overgrown concrete bunkers, and scorched patches of ground that walkers occasionally stumble across on hillsides in Somerset, Yorkshire, and Derbyshire, often without realizing what they are looking at. A handful of local museums and heritage boards now mark the more accessible sites, and researchers continue to use aerial photography and archive records held at the National Archives to identify others that have never been formally surveyed. No blue plaque marks Colonel Turner's contribution in the way it might for a famous pilot or a celebrated aircraft designer, and his name remains almost entirely unknown outside specialist military history circles. Yet for a few crucial years over Britain's darkest skies, Turner and his small team of engineers, carpenters, and former film technicians made absolutely certain that what German bomber crews believed they were seeing was not the truth. In doing so, working from concrete bunkers with nothing more dramatic than oil, coal, and carefully timed switches, they left behind one of the quietest, least celebrated, and most effective deception campaigns of the entire Second World War.